All right, so talk a little bit about chromosomes and inheritance today. So this is just a review. Remember, this is a picture of what's called a karyotype. And that karyotype right here, right, is just a picture of the condensed chromosome during mitosis. So that's a karyotype. Remember, you have 23 pairs or 46 chromosomes. Within those, you have autosomes. So autosomes are non-sex chromosomes, right? So autosomes would be all those chromosomes that are not sex chromosomes or don't determine sex. So you have 44 autosomes or 22 pairs, right? You have two sex chromosomes. There's an X and a Y, and they're right here, right? So in our species, 2X has the sex of female, and XY has the sex of male. So if you have a Y, you're a male, and if you have no Y, you're a female. Because we do have conditions we'll talk about next time we meet. XXX is still a female. Right? XXY is still a male. Okay? So it's caused by a condition called non-disjunction, which we'll talk about in the future, but that's pretty much what we have. Remember, these pairs of chromosomes are called homologous, and you see that these chromosomes are ranked by size, right? So the tallest being chromosome 1 and the second tallest being chromosome 2, but homologous means that their centromeres are in the same location and all the genes are in the same location. You can look at this picture on the bottom, and the dotted line is the centromere location, right? And those banding patterns you see are the gene patterns that we typically see with condensed chromosomes. All right, so let's introduce what's called a pedigree chart. I know you watched another video on pedigree charts. So pedigree charts are ways that we show heredity. In genetics, they'll use pedigree charts to counsel family members on the potential that offspring will have diseases. So a couple things about pedigree charts that we probably already know. A square is a male, and a circle is a female, right? So that's the way we use them. The line between them shows reproduction. So the line between them shows reproduction, and that vertical line, the horizontal line one does, and the vertical line is your descendant line, okay? And then the horizontal line after that will be where we have our siblings, our children, okay? So if we look at this top pedigree, right, so a couple things we notice, right? So if we look at here, and this is generation 1, and this is generation 2, and generation 3. You'll notice that these ones on top have lines through them. So a line through a box or a circle means deceased, right? So that first generation is all dead. They might be deceased because they were old. Right? They may be deceased because they had a disease, or they were part of some tragedy. We don't know, that just means deceased. If you have a darkened area, so you see these squares are darkened, right? When those darkened means affected by a disease, right? So you can see right here, affected individuals, right, are affected by diseases. If you saw one that was half shaded, it means that they were heterozygous for recessive disease, an autosomal recessive disease, right? So if I had a square and a circle, right? So I guess we can't say married these days. We used to say marriage line, but now it's just a breeding line. And we have this, and they had 3 offspring. And we did genetic studies on those offspring, right? So this way you could say was, oops, that is not correct. This one we could say was carrier for recessive disease. This one we could say has the recessive disease. This one we could say is not a carrier, and this one is a carrier. Okay, so that's what that means. If I had right, so if I had a dot in the middle, dot means carrier of a sex-linked disease, right? So sex-linked diseases, we'll talk about later, usually are on the X chromosome, right? So this person over here is XY. This person over here, right, has a recessive disease for color blindness. Right. This person over here gets a color blindness gene from the mother. This person over here, and I can make that person a carrier for you. And this person over here. Since men only have one X chromosome, if you get that recessive disease that's linked to the X chromosome, you'll be affected. So a couple other things. We can have a situation where we have that double line means cosanguinous marriage, right? It means, or cosanguinous union. It means in the same family. Right? If we have things in the same family, we tend to get an increase in recessive diseases. Not legal in this country. This is what I used to refer to as the Alabama line. Right? All right, so that means cosanguinous. If we had something like that, that would be twins. This would be monozygous twins, I mean identical twins, right? So we have different things here, right? Monozygous, dizygous. A diamond would be sex unspecified. Usually that's if you're getting reports. I know they had a child, but I don't know what the child was. We'd use a diamond. You have abortions. Right, so there's a whole bunch of different things. Okay, so those are pedigrees, and we use pedigree charts to document relatedness. All right, so let's just go through a couple different things. All right, so dominant traits, and this one I'm going to tell you because it's important. So dominant traits, there's a couple different ones, and I'll give you a list of diseases you want to look at. So dominant traits usually are expressed each generation, and they affect males and females. Okay? They usually affect males and females. All right. So if we look at this pedigree, right, so we have the male, right? So here's what we know about these dominant traits. All right, so we can say this male here is, I don't want to use X, so we just keep using A. So this male here is A, and we don't know because it's dominant, but we know that this female here is heterozygous recessive because she doesn't have a disease. We have this offspring here in 2, 2, 1. We know that this offspring has at least one dominant allele. Number 3 here has no dominant allele. Number 5 here has at least one dominant allele. 6 has no dominant allele, and 8 has dominant allele. All right, so we know that. Right, and then we could do the same thing for the next generation. Okay, so usually they're passed because you only need one allele. We talk about multifactorial. Remember, penetrance is the effect of this disorder, or how often it occurs. So multifactorial, nature and nurture. Remember, we talked about that a little bit. So polygenic inheritance causes multifactorial. Many genes affect a single trait, right? A disease that has a genetic basis, but penetrance is tied to environmental issues, heart disease, diabetes type 2, or adult onset diabetes. If you have heart disease in your family or adult onset diabetes, you have a tendency toward that, but you can change your path somewhat based on nurture or your prevention of that disease. So we know that adult onset diabetes is tied to a lack of activity and poor dietary habits, so you can change that a little bit with activity, a non-sedentary lifestyle, and diet and exercise. Right. So expression of trait recessive. So recessive disorders, right? So a couple things. If you're homozygous, you're called a carrier, right? So we have a couple. So these cystic fibrosis and sickle cell are classic ones. They're actually codominant diseases, but they have a recessive pedigree pattern based on low penetrance. So in the heterozygous state, the person doesn't exhibit the disease, but they're still what they call a carrier, right? So mating of close relatives increases disorders. That's that cosanguinous line I showed you, right? So these often skip generations. So they often skip generations. And they affect males and females. This pedigree right here is not showing it skipping generations. But it just shows, it does show skipping generations. So if you look at the parents, right, the first generation, we know that dad is affected, so he'd be 2 smalls. And mom, we don't know what she is, right? Right, so she's at least 1 capital, and we don't know what the other one is. We don't know if she's a carrier or not. They show all the carriers here from genetic studies, but if she's the first one, she's probably not been tested. If you look at generation 2, there's nobody, none are affected. But all the offspring are carriers because dad had the recessive disease. So all of them have at least 1 recessive allele. Right? If you look at the next generation, right, I don't have anybody with the diseases, but I have carriers. So these are not affected as well. But if we look at the 4th generation, all of a sudden I get somebody with the disease again, because those carriers, right, those carriers are passed through generations. So we see that people with the disease often skip generations. That's a recessive pattern. So codominant traits we talked about before, like the blood system, right? I won't go a bunch into it anymore. but you can review that at your leisure. Sex determination we already talked about in humans, XY, but different species have different sex determinations. In a grasshopper, it's an XO system, right? If you have a single X, you're a male, and you have two X's, you're a female. You have haploid diploid systems like in bees and ants, so you have different systems. Just know that in human species, if you have a Y, you're biologically male. So it's a difference between gender identification. That's a topic for probably health class, but in biology, for the biological species, or our biological species, if you have a Y, you're biologically male. And again, before you start sending me a bunch of emails, it has nothing to do with gender identification. Okay, so I'm just talking biological species. All right, expression of traits, sex length. Right, so sex length, a little different. So sex length is usually associated with the X chromosome. Right? And the reason is there's very few genes on the Y chromosome. Right? There's hairy ears, and there's TF, which is testicular differentiating factor, which helps male secondary characteristics. So it's usually associated with the X chromosome, right? And you'll have an X, and then you'll have a D, right? And this D is for Duchenne's muscular dystrophy. So it may have low penetrance, or it does have low penetrance in females, even if it's a dominant, based on random X activation. So if you think about the biological female, she has two X's, right? But in each cell, I'll make this one green, but in each cell, one of the X's is randomly inactivated, right? So maybe she expresses the green X here and the red X here, right, in another cell. So essentially, even with a dominant disease, an X-dominant disease, it is inherited as a recessive pattern in females. Okay, so if we look at this pedigree for X-linked dominant inheritance, or even X-linked recessive, it doesn't matter. Well, this is X-linked dominant. So we know that this female up here right, this male is X and has a disease with a Y, and this female is XD. Right? So I thought I switched this, but it may not have saved. But generally speaking, we wouldn't see this. So these generally would be carriers and not all the way dark. Right? So generally speaking, these ones right here should be listed like that. They should be unaffected due to random X activation, right? And the affected should be the male offsprings, right? And all the females should be carriers. Right, so if you see only affected males, right? Oh, I get it. All right, this is why we have affected males. I apologize. All right. So if this is something like color blindness, so the male is colorblind, and the female doesn't exhibit color blindness, right? So this one right here is XD, XD. This one right here is XD and Y. This one right here is XD, XD. And this one right here, XD and Y. And this one right here is XD. So unfortunate that the mother was a carrier. When we get down to here, this one right here should be darkened too. It's wrong because since the female is dominant, right, and she has both of them, she would pass it to all her male offspring. So each male would be, he is not, so this one over here should be a carrier. There's no way this child would exhibit it, right? Over here, this male has to be, so she's not. Over here, nobody has the disease. She could still be a carrier. We don't know. Over here, she has it, so her male offspring all have to have it. Females do not, right? He doesn't have it, so this one would be a carrier. So I'll give you a different pedigree. I copied a different one onto my slide, but didn't get copied onto this. So hopefully that helps out a little bit, and I'll talk to you soon.